Next up in the Leaders Summit plenary is a deep dive on the issue of climate change and, equally importantly, climate ambition. So without further ado, let me hand over to a long-time friend and supporter of the Global Compact, the UK's high-level climate action champion, Nigel Topping.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the UN Global Compact's 20th Anniversary Leaders Summit. My name is Nigel Topping, and as the UK's high-level climate action champion, I'm working closely with my colleague, the Chilean high-level climate action champ, Gonzalo Munoz, to strengthen collaboration and drive action from businesses, investors, organisations, cities and regions on climate change, and to coordinate this work with governments and parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Our session today is going to focus on climate ambition, uniting business and governments for a 1.5 degree future in a post-COVID world. But I want to start by acknowledging that although we're talking about climate here, we're very much still living in a COVID and not yet a post-COVID world, a world that's shaken by multiple interconnected crises. We are seeing economies and societies reeling from the effects of the pandemic, and many governments continuing to tackle a raging health crisis right now. And we see communities in eastern India and Bangladesh devastated by the most powerful cyclone to hit the region in decades. And at the same time, structural racism continues to be prevalent in our societies. We urgently need to dismantle racist structures and reform racist institutions, and recognise that corporate responsibility extends not only to climate action, but also to universal respect and support for human rights. There can be no climate justice without social justice. In fact, just last night, I joined a webinar from Natura, the Brazilian-based cosmetics company, to hear their very impressive new commitments to net zero by 2030 and human rights throughout the supply chain, gender parity in the management structure, circular economy, and more. Really good example, I think, of leadership from the corporate sector. And against this backdrop, we must strengthen calls for social justice to be at the heart of the climate movement, not just from a few leaders, but across the whole movement. Because visionary climate leaders know that business as usual is no longer an option. We must build thriving economies and societies that work for people and planet. And so today we're gathered here virtually, but we're honoured to have, in true United Nations Global Compact style, as a multi-stakeholder initiative, representatives from governments, from the UN, from business and civil society, joining us today from their homes and offices all around the world. Just a few days ago on World Environment Day, Gonzalo and I launched a race to zero, running up to COP26, which will now take place in Glasgow in November 2021. This is an international campaign for a healthy, resilient, zero carbon recovery. It brings together an unprecedented coalition of net zero emission initiatives covering businesses, cities, regions, universities and investors, and we think we'll add many thousands of schools and sport organisations and national parks in the months to come. These real economy actors join 120 countries who've already formed the Climate Ambition Alliance, creating the largest ever alliance committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. Many of them already have targets in the 2040s or earlier. Many of you on this call are part of this campaign by aligning with the 1.5 degree pathway through the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree campaign. And the fact that I'd most like to share with everyone is that already all of those countries in the Climate Ambition Alliance and all of those non-party stakeholders who've also joined the Rate to Zero cover 53% of the global economy. So it's a long way to go to 100, but we've made a really good start to the Race to Zero. But now, without further ado, I'm honoured to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General and Deputy Chair of the Elders, who's going to set the scene for today's meeting.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to address you on the 20th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations Global Compact. I would usually start such a video address by apologizing for not being able to join you in person. But in these extraordinary times, such a situation has become very normal. We find ourselves in uncharted territory, facing life-changing scenarios that would seem unimaginable just a month ago. Whilst COVID-19 demands the world's attention, we must not forget that the problems faced by humanity prior to the pandemic have not gone away. Violent conflicts, nuclear proliferation, the climate crisis. These threats and injustices are still there, and in many senses further exacerbated by the pandemic. We all need to take action against another terrible pandemic, racism. Speaking as a deputy chair of the Elders, the group of independent global leaders founded by Nelson Mandela, I want to convey our abhorrence of racism in all its forms and our solidarity with all those fighting for a world free from prejudice. The barbaric killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis has shone a light on pervasive discrimination, prejudice, and impunity in the United States. The global wave of outrage sparked by his death and the violent response to overwhelmingly peaceful protests shows how racism resonates all over the world. I urge the international system as a whole, including the members of the Global Compact, to do much more to acknowledge the discrimination faced by minority populations around the world and advance concrete solutions to further the cause of equality and justice. The pandemic is no excuse for inaction on racism or the other existential threats facing humanity. Whilst the governments, businesses, civil society, and individuals are rightly preoccupied with the saving lives and livelihoods, it is crucial to our enduring health and sustainability that we do not neglect the long-term challenges we face. Indeed, tackling their causes and consequences as a global community is the only way we will ultimately overcome this pandemic. Arguably, this need for a joined-up approach is most crucial in relation to climate change. The climate crisis has been altering the character of our planet and threatening our existence. Those affected by extreme weather conditions continue to be so. Those suffering displacement due to droughts, losing their homes to coastal erosion, and putting their lives on the line to defend their environment, continue to face the realities of the climate emergency every day. I am very pleased to see that Brianna Freehan will be speaking to you today. The Elders have been working with Brianna and other young climate activists to elevate their call for continued climate action. Businesses must recognize the growing demand of their shareholders and other stakeholders for genuine carbon neutrality strategies across their supply chains. These plans can no longer be confined to the edges of business practices. They must be at the heart of strategic planning, go beyond the bare minimum required by national legislation, and include the full and transparent disclosure of climate-related financial risk. Crucially, this action must be driven by science-based targets, as this is an essential way in which corporations can contribute to tackling the climate emergency. These are now must-have approaches, vital to building momentum around urgent and ambitious climate action. In this regard, I commend the Global Compact for its leadership. The business community has an important leadership role here. Not only can it help shape government commitments through its own strategies, but it can also help build a global consensus around mitigation and adaptation. At a time when political leaders appear to be shirking their responsibilities under the Paris Climate Change Agreement. I support the recent call of my successor, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, that the COVID recovery must prioritize people and the environment. It must invest for our future, not for our past. It must see an end to all fossil fuel subsidies and fully incorporate climate risk into the financial system. This ambition needs to be agreed between nations, considered in all national policymaking decisions, and borne out in enhanced nationally determined contributions, NDC. To do this requires a due level of multilateral cooperation and political will, something far beyond the ambitions of the pre-COVID world. It requires economic diversification policies in oil exporting countries, the rapid phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, and export financing and incentives for the large-scale development of renewable energy infrastructure. It requires decision makers, business leaders, and global citizens to think and act differently without further delay. 6 months ago, such demands would have seemed impossible to many. Detractors would have said, we cannot possibly shift an economy at that speed. We cannot ask people to accept such rapid changes. But if the events of 2020 demonstrate something else, it is that it is within our power to take tremendous action when faced with a clear and present danger. Like COVID-19, the climate crisis is a threat to all of us. And like COVID-19, it requires all of us to be part of the solution. I urge more businesses to join efforts with the UN Global Compact to build a better future for all. Thank you for this opportunity to address you, and I wish you fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for setting the scene so clearly, and particularly for pointing out that we're able to go much faster in this transition than we'd ever thought, really, that imagination and courage are the main barriers to overcome. So now we're going to turn to our panel. We're going to have a conversation focusing on building back better, on a better recovery. And we know that as countries are working on economic aid and recovery packages in response to the pandemic, and as they prepare to submit enhanced national determined contributions, as the Secretary General pointed out, governments are being required to reimagine a better future grounded in bold climate action. Just recently, CEOs from more than 170 companies have supported the statement uniting business and governments to recover better, calling on governments to reimagine a better future grounded in such bold climate action. And that statement from the companies in the Science Based Targets Initiative and its Business Ambition for 1.5 Degrees campaign is the largest ever UN-backed CEO-led climate advocacy effort. It's just another example of momentum growing faster and faster. And we have multinationals reaffirming their own science-based target commitments to achieve net zero and calling on governments to match their ambition in the COVID-19 recovery packages. And as of today, we're at 895. I check it nearly every day. Nearly 900 companies already aligned to science-based targets, and close to 240 of those are committed to net zero. So now let's turn to our panel. I'm delighted to welcome three speakers from different sectors and from different parts of the world. We have Mr. Jose Manuel Entrecanales Domecq, the chairman and CEO of Acciona in Spain. Ms. Sharon Burrow, the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, I think coming to us from Brussels. Sharon, it's like you made it to your office. And Ms. Brianna Fruin, the youth leader and environment advocate from Samoa, who's joining us today from New Zealand. Before I turn to the panelists, just like to ask everybody who's participating in the meeting today, invite you all to engage in the discussion. Please ask questions in the chat box on the right side of your screen. We're very keen to hear what you think, and later on we'll invite the panelists to answer some of your questions. But first of all, just to place our panelists, let me just ask each of you quickly just to let us know where you're joining from, and just a few words on why we must unite across peoples to recover better together. And if I could start by asking Jose Manuel.
Thank you, Nigel. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, or even good night. Yes, indeed. I mean, just a few months ago, we were talking about the changes needed in our global development model, many of which were essential to maintaining, most of which were essential to maintaining the pace of prosperity of the past decades. And now we see all those and many of those endangered by the urgencies of the pandemic. As we start to emerge from the health crisis, we're reminded that the social, economic, and environmental challenges we faced before not only persist, but also have become more acute. The reduction in global poverty, which was before the pandemic starting to stagnate after decades of improvement, could now take a dramatic turn, pushing hundreds of millions of people into extreme poverty. Or a fight against racism is at the top of the social agenda, so it must also become the top priority of businesses. Global temperatures, CO2 concentration, reaching levels every year, higher levels every year, and despite the 8% apparent reduction of this year of 2020, it gives us an idea of the challenge we're facing when 8% of the reduction this year is what we would need to achieve every year for the next 10 to reach the objectives we've set ourselves to meet. So in this pandemic, finding out that is the challenge is a very clear view of how big the difficulties of what we need to achieve are. But in this it is undisputable that profound changes need to be done, and they're very urgent at all costs. But we need to avoid falling into the trap of thinking that the structural challenges we had only begun to tackle before the health crisis can be put aside, even temporarily, in order to deal with the economic consequence of the pandemic. Precisely because we need to jumpstart the global economy, we have a huge opportunity to accelerate the investment needed to achieve the SDGs, 72% of which are based on developing sustainable infrastructure. So looking at the bright side, the good news is that the measures needed to overcome the enormous social and economic challenges of our time are the same as the ones stemming from the pandemic. And of course, governments alone will not have the economic means to finance such huge investments. It will require the joint effort from all parts of society, but very much in particular, the business sector. And again, looking at the bottle half full, quick and bold action will turn challenges into opportunities by creating a whole new industrial sector of successful businesses with sustainability at their strategic core. So in the short term, there's an enormous opportunity for the business sector to participate and to benefit from the short-term economic recovery efforts. But in the long run, any business that doesn't play a positive role in the social, economic, and environmental transformation already underway will definitely not survive. So let us seize this opportunity to jumpstart the global economy while leapfrogging to a new, socially inclusive, decarbonized economic model.
Thank you, Jose Manuel, and we'll come back to you later to talk more about the importance and the reasons for business leadership in responding to this challenge. Let me turn now to Sharon. Sharon, just help everyone by letting people know where you're from and some early thoughts on why we must unite across peoples for this better recovery.
Well, indeed, we're living in this semi-virtual, semi-physical world, and I'm on a rostered day in the office. So it's a very pleasant day here at the global office of the ITUC in Brussels. Nigel, I want to thank the Secretary General for his leadership on racial injustice, as well as climate, financing the SDGs, and the hope of a better future. We support the 1.5 campaign of the Global Compact, but it will take all of us, and it will require that we act on climate, employment, and social protection at the same time to ensure that we align people and the planet with a new economic model. It will require a just transition with no stranded workers and no stranded communities. Massive inequality, income, race, gender, unemployment, homelessness, poverty, wages. You already know these were driving an age of anger with civil unrest and a distrust, tragically, in democracy. Along with the destruction resulting from extreme weather events driven by climate change, we face the choices, in addition to all of that, associated with the best and the worst impacts of technology that is often devoid of a rights base. And now COVID-19, which of course originated as a health crisis. We all gave up civic freedoms, economic liberties to in fact save lives. That was just. But now, of course, its impact is a massive social and economic crisis. For trade unions, I can assure you, we see twin challenges of employment, climate action that must be integrated into recovery, where we both employment and climate proof our future with the resilience of vital public services and universal social protection. But it will take transparent governance. It will take social dialogue with business and trade unions, civil society in many areas working together. And I want to just say that financing the recovery will require a national and global solidarity that shifts the parameters for financing and debt. We know that, in fact, we have to have global solidarity. The poorest of countries must have a global fund for social protection. It's such a small amount of money by comparison with the current economic indeed spend. But we must see investment in jobs, in sustainable infrastructure, in industry policy, in health, education and care, and the development and repair of ecosystems, along with digital connectivity for all. There are jobs, jobs and jobs in this new integrated sustainable world. And we want to work with all of you, with our $40 trillion of pension funds dedicated to human rights and sustainability to get those jobs back into place and provide people with hope. I would just say in conclusion, it will take a shift in our mindset about longer term investment and patient capital, we call it, and patient debt, longer term management of debt. So with that and an extension of debt relief for the poorest of countries and a return to fair and just taxation measures and an end to tax evasion, we say together we can make a difference.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm really struck by your phrase, an age of anger, and a lot of what you talk about in terms of trust building and solidarity. So I'll come back later and to try and dig a bit deeper into what does a just transition look like. Maybe you can give us a couple of examples. A picture paints 1,000 words. It'd be useful to hear some examples. Let me turn to Brianna Fruin now. And Brianna, tell people, let us know where you're from and your first thoughts on why we must unite to recover better.
Thank you, Nigel. Talofa lava. I'm calling in from Aotearoa, New Zealand, but I'm from the little Pacific island of Samoa. I think, similar to what my fellow two panelists said, that the COVID-19 situation really put our global family under a microscope. It really picked out what is our strengths in this world and a lot of our weaknesses and the injustices within our systems. I know that when the Pacific were first planning for our COVID-19 response, we were also hit with a cyclone. And that to us was really proof that although the rest of the world may be able to put their lives on pause, there were some of us in struggling and vulnerable communities to this climate situation that could not pause the climate crisis. And I think that that was a louder call than ever, that we need to do more than just try and get back to normal, but we need to, like you said, Nigel, reimagine what a more just world looks like, what a just recovery looks like, and really plan for that, to really up our ambition and make sure that we are planning for a world where our whole global family is taking one big step together and no one is being left behind.
Great, thank you, Brianna, and we'll come back to you in a minute to hear more about what that reimagined future might look like. So great, so we've got really diverse views. This is wonderful, and I'd like to now just dig a bit deeper with the panelists. And let me turn to Jose Manuel. So Jose, you've been one of the first companies to set a validated science-based targets in line with 1.5 degrees, and you also signed the statement of uniting businesses and governments to recover better. Just not everybody expects this sort of leadership from business, but as we're all saying, we're going to need a lot more. What led you personally as a leader to the decision to go beyond looking after the business to sending out a message to governments around the world? And what do you think the role of this kind of corporate leadership is in a time of global crisis?
Right. Well, as you know, Nigel, we've been at it for quite a while now. So over 25 years of trying to transform our business into into an purely ESG oriented operation. Obviously, the ESG concept is kind of new in town, but particularly on the G side, I don't know how new it is, but it's kind of the past 10 years. The truth is that some time ago, say 10, 15, 20 years ago, this was totally of the map for companies, for corporations, and the transition to a higher degree of consciousness from the corporate world, from the business world, has been constant. But I must say, I don't feel we're there yet. We have such a big challenge ahead of us, and we have lost so much time. I mean, 25 years, for Christ's sake, it's where we should have been. We are where we should have been, say, maybe 10, 15 years ago. So now time has reached a point that we can't really leave it to the independent decision of the business world. I think we now need to go on to a number of regulatory measures that make that. I mean, you were saying before, I think it's about 1,200 companies accounting for 24 trillion or 25 trillion of market capitalization that have signed the the 1.5 degree objectives, frankly, that's about 25% of the world's market cap, of the global market capitalization. We can't really afford not to have 75% of the market capitalization of the world out of this objective. So I think we need to go into regulatory measures that make it compulsory. I think we need to have a mandatory core commitment, and particularly in this situation where it can be aligned to stimulus package. We need to develop smart carbon price. We need to consider climate as a financial risk and opportunity factor. Probably the EU carbon taxonomy internationally, exporting it internationally would be a great help. And leaning on recovery stimulus and international trade agreements for local implementation of robust and international regulatory framework as possible. I think that is what needs to be done at this stage to accelerate the pace of change.
Thanks, Jose Manuel. I think that's we sometimes talk about the ambition loop. That if you like, voluntary leadership measures are great. They raise the bar, but they can only go so far. And as you say, 25% is impressive, but we need 100%. And so I think our hope collectively is that regulators, policymakers around the world can see the evidence of your and other business leaders as something which makes it easier for policymakers to be comfortable that they're going to take the whole economy with them. Really helpful. And you talked about transparency, and I think a lot of work that many of you on the call have done with the task force on climate-related financial disclosure and the need to make mandatory disclosure of risks, opportunities, and plans, so that investors. Just yesterday, some of you may have seen that BP announced that they're going to be taking a $13 to $17 billion write-down as they readjust their pricing assumptions in order to make sure that their balance sheet is valued consistently with the Paris Agreement. We still have several major oil companies who don't even publish what their assumption is. So very, very difficult for investors to know whether they're how robust their investment is. So let me turn to Sharon now. Sharon, you mentioned the just transition, and we know that the Secretary General Guterres has recently put forward a set of 6 principles to recover back better. And one of his principles is that we need to have a clean, green, and just transition, one that's fair and leaves no one behind. You've been one of the global pioneers. You are one of the global pioneers and most passionate spokespeople for the idea of a just transition. It's an idea that kind of makes sense to everybody, but it needs to be grounded in real practical reality and steps. Can you just explain a bit more about how do we actually build a just transition, and maybe give us 1 or 2 examples of some that you've seen that have worked that can help to illustrate for people?
Delighted to, and I see Patricia on the screen, and I want to thank Patricia Espinosa for her leadership, because she's always put people and planet at the centre in an equal way, and that's of course what the Secretary General is talking about as well. Just transitions are very simple. It's actually about making sure that we don't have stranded people, workers in particular for us, but communities as well. We've seen many transitions, and we can show you the devastation that climate's creating everywhere. It's not just about weather events and physical destruction, it's lives and livelihoods. And we need to know that we have a plan where people will be at the centre. I want to come back and endorse some of the comments from Asiona, but can I just say to our sister in Samoa, one of my favourite examples, I know you're in New Zealand, is actually Jacinda Ardern's leadership as a PM with the unions, with business, but with our community, as well as Pakeha, as they call the white community in New Zealand. They have actually sat down and worked out plans at the community level, how to save their fishing stocks, how to not see, oil resources destroy their shores, to look at what it means to sustain the rivers and the climate and jobs. So Just transition is investing in people and asking them what they want for a future. It's very simple. It's about dialogue at the workplace and in the community. Good examples, not just New Zealand, but in fact Spain. You know, we have one of the world's greatest environment ministers in Teresa Rivera. She led the revolution to get all of the energy companies committed to sustainable energy, the coal miners, the trade unions, our affiliates at the national level, to agree to a just transition plan for coal miners. It is about reinvesting in people and the community. There are many more. Germany, Canada is not enough, can I say? But there are these conversations going on every day, and that's what it's about. Can I just say that the comments around regulation are right. You talked about 25%. Of that 25% who signed up, maybe 20% of them, like Acciona and other companies, are leading the charge. And our investors are in the same mode. So we need regulation on the environment and the social aspects of ESG. It's time. We're way beyond time. And we need to set a fair trade or a competition floor for those companies that are out in front, Nigel, because otherwise we're relying on the good guys, while in fact the profit take from those who don't care about planet or their people is ongoing. And you only have to walk my life in some of the supply chains to see the dehumanising exploitation that still exists in our current model of business. Mandated due diligence. The EU's committed it. We need it everywhere. We're asking business to do with us. We're prepared, and some companies are using unions like Unilever and Danone and others to identify where there are risks, both environmental and human rights. Look at what the repair, the remedy will take, and then monitoring those supply chains. We can do better. But regulation now has to have a role if we're going to meet the test of the SDGs and a planet where people and the environment are aligned.
Thank you, Sharon. I think it's really encouraging to hear from Jose Manuel, business leaders talking about the need for regulation, and then from you with your role at the head of the ITUC, talking about the need for dialogue about the future. So not clinging to the past, but how do we collect? And I think that idea of dialogue is so important to, as you said, to overcome an age of anger and to build trust. We have to be able to hear each other, listen to the different points of view, because we won't navigate the kind of complex transition that is facing us if we don't have an understanding and appreciation for these different perspectives. And so let me turn now to Brianna, who really represents two crucial perspectives, both being based in a small island state and also being a representative of young people, two communities who are both least responsible for climate change, but most hurt by its impact and have most at stake in the future. Brianna, you've recently issued a call for the world to respond to the challenges of climate change with creative resilience. I love that idea. We talked about imagination earlier. Can you tell us a bit more about what do you mean by creative resilience?
Thank you, Nigel. When there's a saying in the Pacific that when the land is in pain, warriors are born. And so in this period of pain that our world has been experiencing, I've seen many warriors born across the world. Young people who live in the age of technology and information that have taken these tools available to them and upskilled themselves to be able to organize in a world that was struggling with COVID-19. I've seen online strikes being organized. I myself was a part of an online fellowship for young community organizers. And so we were upskilling on Zoom calls on how to organize our communities during this time. I've seen young people organize fundraising pages to organize relief funds during Cyclone Harold in the Pacific. And so I've seen all these creative ways that young people and community organizers in indigenous communities have come together to try and adapt to what our world is looking like today. And I think that this really showed me when the scientists had to close up their labs, when politicians had to close their conference rooms, the people who continued this climate work were those who could not afford to stop it. And I think that this is further proof for all of us in this climate movement who are trying to call for a just transition, who are trying to call for climate, not just climate action, but climate justice, that we really need to be centering the voices and centering the ideas and centering the call of action of those who cannot afford to stop what they're doing, who cannot afford to turn back or to look back into a world where we didn't do our absolute best for all of our community and for all of our global family. And so I really call upon the world to not just look at solving this crisis in the traditional ways that we may think of, which is through, policy, through science, and we look to our leaders and we look to people in high places, but we also must be looking to our communities who are being affected, because I've experienced that many of the solutions that we need are actually coming from those communities who have had to adapt very quick and very fast. So yes, it's been very inspirational to see this creative resilience come into fruition during this time.
Thank you, Brian. I love the idea that saying that when the land is in pain, warriors are born, and something that Gonzalo and I often, we have this privileged title of high-level champions, but we say we need 7.5 billion champions or 7.5 billion climate warriors. So thank you. I think we've got time for one more question for each of our panelists, if we can keep it quite brief. Jose Manuel, I wanted to come back to you and talk about risk, because it seems to me that as the chair of a big company, one of the things that you're responsible for is looking forward and thinking about risk and managing. I think that the emergence of the pandemic has shown us that the link, when humans destroy biodiversity, we destroy the system that sustains life. And so in that sense, climate change is a classic risk multiplier that's leading to severe weather events, the rising sea levels, which are affecting the Pacific Island communities that Brianna represents, the pandemic, all sorts of risk multipliers. How do you think that, if you like, the skills of looking forward and risk management that are taught and are needed in the corporate world might contribute towards a better interconnected solution?
Well, that actually brings us back to the former questions in some way, because the business, as you all know, is all about risk management, risk return management. This is the key to our role. And when we talk about regulation, and when we talk about trying to have higher standards of moral ethics, what we're doing is we are putting the long term in front of the short term. Now, the problem is, if the short term is too costly, you may not even reach the long term. So the short term comes first. And what the regulation is intended to do is to make it a level playing field for all those companies which intend to play the long term. So it ceases to be a luxury. Long term ceases.
So that really, I'm just gonna switch to that. Really goes to what Sharon was saying, that the need for regulation to make sure that leaders don't end up being penalized for leading. So as you say, if you commit to the long term and then end up having a short term disadvantage, only regulation can address that. Let me, just before we switch to our closing remarks, I just got a question from the audience about inclusion and diversity. So I'd like to just ask Sharon and Brianna, just for maybe a sort of 2 sentences each, on what's your advice for the climate movement to increase diversity and inclusion? Maybe I'll go to Brianna first, and then Sharon.
Thank you. I think for this climate conversation to be more diverse, we need to be looking at who do we have at our tables. When we look around at these decision-making processes, are all the voices as diverse as what the world looks like? And I think that all of us and all companies, all civil society groups, and all of international NGOs and IGOs need to be looking into their own staff and their own systems and seeing if they are as colorful as we need them to be.
Great, thank you, Brianna. And it's something that Gonzalo and I are really committed to working on with the Marrakesh Partnership community, the community of non-state actors that we work with this year. And Sharon, over to you. I mean, what would be your advice to the movement as a whole? I mean, if you want your advice to me as somebody who's got a job coordinating and is committed to increasing diversity, what are the practical steps we should take to improve diversity and inclusion?
Well, children don't see class, privilege, race, so why do we? Why do we make money if we're not prepared to share it and have generated an economic model on a massive scale of inequality that's creating many of the fractures today? We can do better. So on June 24th, we're going to try, Nigel, with many businesses and trade unions all around the world, we're going to host the largest conversation about how to climate and employment-proof our workplace with the challenge of looking at who we are. Are we diverse enough? Is there a racial injustice frame for the work that we do? We invite all of you to join us, and we believe, as in fact you just heard, you have to take it back to the ground. We know what needs to be done, but if we're going to build trust and action, we need workers, their communities, people everywhere to join the quest for a sustainable and a just future.
Thank you, Sharon. Fantastic note to end on. I look forward to joining that event on the 24th. So we're going to close the panel there. Fantastic panel. I really appreciate Jose Manuel, Sharon, Brianna, your thoughtful remarks. Thank you all for your leadership in different areas, but I think really representing the kind of diversity and dialogue that we need to tackle the challenge of the scale that we have. I'm now going to move to a closing remarks. I'm delighted. I'm looking forward to hearing from a good friend, Patricia Espinosa from Bonn. But first, we're going to hand over to His Excellency Carlos Alvarado, the President of Costa Rica, to give his closing remarks by video.
Hola, les habla Carlos Alvarado, Presidente de la República de Costa Rica. Con gran placer me dirijo a ustedes en este foro para compartir la visión de mi país al respecto de estos momentos de crisis que estamos viviendo como humanidad, así como algunas de las acciones que como nación hemos llevado adelante con el fin de asegurar un futuro próspero para nuestra gente. Como ustedes saben, la crisis del cambio climático no ha aminorado con la pandemia del COVID-19. Esta más bien ha servido como una ventana al futuro que nos ha permitido visibilizar las consecuencias negativas del cambio climático sobre las sociedades, sobre sus aparatos productivos, sus sistemas económicos y sus estructuras políticas. La reconstrucción post-COVID debe implicar una transformación verde, sostenible e inclusiva, guiada por los esfuerzos más ambiciosos de todos los sectores de desarrollo hacia la consecución de las tres principales metas del Acuerdo de París. Primero, limitar las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero para que la temperatura global no aumente por encima de 1.5 grados. Segundo, debe acelerar las acciones de adaptación al cambio climático. Y último, transformar los flujos financieros de modo tal que sean compatibles con un desarrollo bajo en emisiones de carbono. Así tiene que verse la nueva economía post-COVID y también de cara al cambio climático. Deseo aprovechar esta ocasión para invitar al UN Global Compact a coadyuvar con el llamado que Costa Rica mantiene hacia otros estados desde hace décadas de recortar el gasto militar para así financiar una recuperación económica, inclusiva y sostenible, alineado con las metas del Acuerdo de París y para superar la crisis del COVID-19. No existe momento más oportuno que este para hacer un llamado enérgico a aumentar la ambición en la acción climática. Así como la información científica más actualizada debe ser la base de las decisiones y acciones que se toman para la recuperación económica del planeta, las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza deben ser una pieza clave de la ruta para reactivar la economía con una visión verde de desarrollo sostenible e inclusivo, dando paso a economías descarbonizadas más respetuosas de los derechos humanos. Costa Rica, un país de renta media, ha apostado por la inversión en naturaleza para generar bienestar y crecimiento. Sabemos que la retribución económica de invertir en adaptación y mitigación al cambio climático, la preservación de la biodiversidad y de los ecosistemas es más alta y rentable que las inversiones que destruyen la naturaleza. Nuestro Plan Nacional de Descarbonización 2022-2050 es un ejemplo de que sí es posible trazar una ruta para llegar a cero emisiones netas y seguir creciendo económicamente. Reconocemos que las alianzas e iniciativas público-privadas son esenciales para generar los cambios que conducen al desarrollo económico sostenible, razón por la cual el Estado costarricense ha procurado una articulación con el sector privado para avanzar en la transformación radical de los modelos productivos con una visión de descarbonización. Durante la Precop 25 del pasado octubre que se llevó a cabo en Costa Rica, el sector financiero nacional firmó el Protocolo Verde para la Banca, un esfuerzo común para la creación e implementación de políticas precursoras, multiplicadoras y demostrativas de mejores prácticas bancarias que promueven un desarrollo sostenible y resiliente a los efectos del cambio climático y que no comprometen las necesidades de las generaciones presentes ni futuras. Abogamos a hacer un llamado como comunidad internacional a los bancos multilaterales e instituciones financieras de desarrollo para que incorporen indicadores de vulnerabilidad climática, sostenibilidad y resiliencia en sus mecanismos de financiamiento y favorezcan proyectos que incorporen acciones de mitigación y adaptación al cambio climático y protección de la biodiversidad. Asimismo, resulta necesario que el sistema financiero internacional incorpore indicadores ambientales en línea con el Acuerdo de París en sus evaluaciones de riesgo crediticio y fiscal. Vamos a salir adelante, pero tenemos que hacerlo juntas y juntos, dando lo mejor de nosotros mismos, como naciones, como comunidad internacional y como humanidad. Hoy, más que nunca, es el tiempo para el multilateralismo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, President Alvarado. Thank you for your personal leadership and for the leadership of Costa Rica. As you say, we're really going to have to do this together, and your leadership provides a great example for others to learn from. And I'm going to, for the final closing remarks, I'm going to turn to Ms. Patricia Espinosa, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Over to you, Patricia.
Thank you, Nigel, and let me start by thanking you for allowing me to be part of this morning's discussion with this great group of leaders. Thank you also to Global Compact for organizing this incredible Leaders Summit, which helps us a lot in maintaining the conversation alive, especially now where we have to adapt to these new conditions. And let me start by saying that we at UN Climate Change have always recognized the need for businesses and other non-state actors to join with governments to fulfill the Paris Agreement and achieve the 1.5-degree future. This is part of what we call the inclusive multilateralism. And today we recognize, of course, that COVID-19 is humanity's most significant and pressing challenge. But certainly from a climate perspective, the virus has also helped to open our eyes to what a global crisis really looks like. And as we respond to COVID's demands for urgent and immediate action, we cannot forget that the climate emergency still remains and also demands an urgent response. While nations have made limited progress with their climate commitments, they are not enough. We know that they are not close to what we need. They are not enough, as we are used to saying these days, to flatten the curve. For a long time, we have been seeing 2020 as a vital year for climate change. And we knew that the agenda that we had to deliver is really daunting. And that has not changed because of COVID-19. So in this year, and for going up to COP26, we need to complete the unfinished business from COP25. We need to fulfill commitments under the Paris Agreement, under the pre-2020 agenda. Nations must submit new or revised NDCs, as you have already very clearly mentioned, and state and non-state actors alike must significantly boost their climate ambition. And this is why this summit and the efforts by private sector and other non-state parties are so important. We have been also providing platforms to perform and to present these experiences. And you participated in the June Momentum. I think that was also a very important opportunity to keep this conversation and the exchanges alive. We launched the Race to Zero campaign together with you, which is objective is mobilizing leadership and support from business, cities, regions, investors, who in turn will create this healthy, resilient, and zero emissions recovery. A recovery that creates jobs so important, as Sharon was mentioning, unlocks sustainable growth in an inclusive way, reduces the risk of future shocks, and does all of this has to be done in a just and fair way. So I do want to emphasize the importance of this Race to Zero campaign. I want to also emphasize the importance of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Thank you also for helping us in promoting it. And we know that we have been talking about for many years about the climate emergency. We are in a climate emergency. Now we have another emergency on top of the climate emergency, and there is absolutely no way that we can address them if we do not take them together. Let me also address one of the points that have been raised by some of the speakers regarding racism. For the United Nations, the fight against racism is absolutely crucial. We have not been immune to racism impact within our own institutions. We must all reflect and act upon the values of solidarity, equality, and diversity that should always guide our work. So, as for progress on our climate change crisis, the bottom line is we cannot get to 2050 without meeting our outstanding commitments for 2020. But I remain an optimist, and I know that if we continue to work together, we will make it. Failure is simply not an option. I believe a brighter and greener future is possible. We can make it happen together. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Patricia. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for a great summary there. We've talked about the triple crisis of climate, health, and inequality, and I think we've heard some great examples of the imagination, scientific understanding, and courage that represent the kind of leadership that we're going to need to have 7.5 billion champions. And finally, we're in a race to zero. I'd urge everybody listening, if you haven't already joined the race, make your public commitment to net zero as soon as possible. And if you're a member of the Global Compact, let's see the Global Compact get all Global Compact members into the race to zero by the time we meet in Glasgow next year. So thank you all for joining us, and look forward to meeting you again on the road to Glasgow in the months ahead. Goodbye.
Thank you so much for your support, Mr. President, and thank you to Nigel Topping and your very high-level panel for your important contribution to this 20th anniversary UN Global Compact Leaders Summit.